Well, on this side of the cross, God said that fellowship with Him, which in the Old Testament was only possible when the sin problem was settled at the tabernacle, now is settled through Jesus Christ. And on this side of the cross, the meaning of the death of Christ to God, the effects of Christ's death upon us who believe, is most clearly taught in the tabernacle. Even in the New Testament, they have to revert, those authors, either Paul, if he wrote both Hebrews and we know he wrote Romans, or Paul and the author of Hebrews, whoever wrote it, the Holy Spirit guiding him. Even those two great books had to revert to the tabernacle to explain Christ's work, as in Romans 3 and as in Hebrews 8 and 9. Well, the cross is God's first aid plan for mankind. It's not His contingency plan. The cross was not an afterthought, a secondary thought. It was the lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. That has always been God's plan. It was God's plan before the foundation of the world that Jesus would be God's lamb. The death of Christ on the cross was the plan and the purpose of God from eternity past. It was not an afterthought brought forth or an emergency solution to the sin dilemma. So when we say that Christ and His cross are set forth in the tabernacle, we're only saying this. It is such a grand plan that God had that He details every single facet of our redemption, of the atoning, efficacious, propitious death of Christ, and details it 1,500 years before the event in such beauty that today you want to understand what Jesus did. You look back and understand by the illumination of the Holy Spirit, as the Apostle Paul did and as the early church did, and see Christ in His beauty in this clearest portrait of all. So when we say Christ and His cross are set forth in the tabernacle, we are reflecting the truth that the death of Christ on the cross was not merely an event 1,900 years ago, but it was part of God's infinite plan. Before Golgotha, the cross was God's plan. Before Calvary, Christ's death was God's plan. So in the Old Testament tabernacle, God planned out every color, every thread, every article of those 7 pieces of furniture, even down to the way the tent was staked into the ground, to speak of Christ's sacrifice. The tabernacle is God's portrait of Christ. We see in it revealed the key doctrines of salvation. The altar, a brazen altar of brass, is the doctrine of satisfaction. How can a holy God be satisfied? The laver of brass is the doctrine of sanctification. How can we worship and consecrate ourselves to service? Only by regular cleansing. Our sin has been dealt with on the cross, but we cannot enter into worshipful, consecrated service to God without regular cleansing. And that's what that laver reminded them at all times. Also, the table of showbread and the lampstand of gold and the altar of incense of gold all reflects the doctrine of worship. Remember that only the veil into the very presence of God was rent, not the entrance into His worship place in the holy place. God says, even though now you can worship me anywhere, you can't worship me anyway. That's the lesson the tabernacle gives, and that's what Jesus reaffirmed in the 4th chapter of John. He said, God is a spirit, and those that worship Him must worship Him in spirit, that's anywhere, but in truth. That's only one way. And that one way is beautifully portrayed in those 3 elements of the holy place. And then the veil which was rent is the doctrine of the incarnation and all the atoning work of Christ. The ark that was made of golden wood is the doctrine of Christology, which shows the deity, the God-man. And then the mercy seat is the doctrine which Paul and the Apostle John use of propitiation